The lieutenant came to me, up to me, and he wanted to reactivate all the things.
Welcome to the second of our 10 meetings for this season for the Lexington Veterans Group. My first item here is to issue a warning. We have a very overzealous parking guy here in Lexington. And unless you like paying $10 fines, you might run out any time and put another quarter. And the guys around here all the time. In fact, a friend of mine paid $100 one time because he parked right here in the handicap lot in the library. Kind of steep, but and I paid a $10 fine myself there. He's around all the time, so I always park around the green because there are no meters there. But even at that, they come around and make a little mark. You're not supposed to be there more than 2 hours or whatever it is. I don't know. So beware of the parking. Tim Whitson is the youngest member of our committee, and he's going to be our December speaker on his time in Vietnam, and he's going to lead us right now in the Pledge of Allegiance. Tim?
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which it stands, under God, liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Mention the coffee one more time. We have 48 cups back there, and enjoy yourself. The first thing I want to discuss today was I feel like a priest now. This is about money. We don't have any budget. Our only source of income is for people leaving stuff in the basket back there. And we do have little expenses. For example, in order to have Charlie operate this camera, you have to pay a $20 fee, which we did a few weeks ago. There's printing. We buy cookies on occasion. The young woman who's so very helpful with all of this stuff, she buys it all and sets it up. Margaret Donovan had knee surgery from the fall. She took in the library here, so she's been out. So we send her flowers, little things like that that stem up. So if you would like, we left the basket back there for that reason. We don't pay for coffee, as you know. Starbucks gives it to us. But if we get ahead on ourselves, and we're behind right now, get ahead on money, we won't put the basket out. But for right now, we do need some funds. So if you're able to, we appreciate it. Charlie Schock, our highly paid cameraman, fell and broke his ankle, but he's sitting here today where he should be home, foot up, drinking a cool one. But he brought a book at the end of last September, and it's called World War II, 4,139 Strange and Fascinating Facts. I'm just going to read 4 of them, I think, and then pass the book around. I'm going to take this book home and read it. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Just bring it back, and we'll circulate it at some later point. We had several books that Bob Edwards brought last fall. Some good stuff about the Army, and we were circulating those around, except they never did get circulated back. If you have any of those at home, bring them back, and people just take them and use them, and hopefully bring them back. This is kind of interesting stuff. I was born in 1931, and in 1943 I was in the 7th grade. Jimmy Baker, also born in 1931. In 1943, he was a private in the U.S. Marine Corps, 12 years old. You might have remembered, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, it doesn't always anymore, his mother kind of turned him in. She found out where he was and called the Marine Corps, and they sent his family back home, 12 years old in the Army. Pretty interesting. I guess that happened more often than we would know about. Do anybody remember the point system? I'm sure a lot do. 469. The point system was a name given to a system devised to send guys home. You get 1 point for every month of service, 1 point for every month overseas, 5 points per battle star, and Congressional Medal of Honor winners could be discharged whenever they chose. But anyway, the people with the most number of points got sent home first. Anybody remember that? Anybody involved in that? No? Well, 1, 2, yeah. Okay. Pretty equitable way to do it, actually. We all remember the voice of Winston Churchill on the beaches and all of that. I won't go over it, but the voice that we heard was not Winston Churchill, actually. It was an actor named Norman Shelley. And he was one of these guys. He was, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the hills, we shall heard by millions around the world, but it wasn't Churchill. It was this actor who filled in for him. He looked like him, I suppose, used the voice. The last thing I want to read pertains to Hanscom Field, and it was Bedford Army Airport. A B-25 bomber took off on July 28, 1945 from Hanscom Field when it was Bedford Field, flown by a 26-year-old lieutenant colonel, graduate of West Point, flown by himself, only guy in the airplane. And he was going down to New York to land somewhere, and there was bad weather. And he got all fouled up. He ran into the Empire State Building. Anybody remember that? I think it was the 87th floor. Anyway, I remember one of the engines went right through. There was an elevator shaft went down and killed some nuns down at the bottom. But that airplane took off from here for the final flight. Anyway, so this is the book. 4139, Strange and Fascinating Facts. If you'd like to use it and bring it back to circulation, please do it. Our next meeting, which is Monday the 13th of November, Brigadier General Oscar DePriest, is a little bit different, and this one will be from 3 o'clock until 5 because we had a problem getting a reservation for this room. There's a group at the high school that uses this room for whatever reason. They want to take it every day, every Monday for the whole month. Well, anyway, they kind of beat us out for the month of November. So next month, and we'll send it out on our email, it's from 3 until 5 o'clock. And on that score, we have a clipboard, and if you'd like to add your name to our mailing list, what do we have now, Phil? Over 100 people? It's a pretty spiffy way to communicate. You can just send a little quick note, it doesn't cost anything. So I'm going to pass this around, and if you would print, if you'd like to get on our list, and this list is strictly between us, nobody else sees it. It's a way of announcing the new schedule. For example, I have this schedule for spring of 2007 right here. I'll pass that around in a minute. But sign up on here. Just make sure you print. It's hard to read some of these. And if you pass it around. For example, one day last year I was away, but there was a snowstorm. Bill, you remember that? Yeah. So the library wasn't open. Young man is supposed to speak on the P-38 fighter. He's speaking actually in December. But we have no way of contacting people. I have to wait to see what the library does. But anyway, if your name is on that list, you can get a real quick email and let you know about those things. I'm going to pass this around. This is our spring. We're booked up through next June, and I have about 5 people on the line, more or less, for after that. And generally, we're about a year ahead of ourselves. And one of the problems that Bill used to have in the former committee, they were generally they'll be speaking at this meeting, trying to get somebody for the next one. And you've got to be way ahead of yourself because there are very good speakers out, like the gentleman speaking to us today. You've got to be way ahead on them. So this is the schedule, if you bring that back, called Spring of '07. The last thing before introducing Jerry is, well, I have some extras of the schedule we're on right now. I'll leave them over here. I'll leave them up here if you want to come take one. And when I get to it in about a week or so, I will send that through email to everybody's house. One of the best things we do here is to provide a place, a venue, if you will, for somebody who has a story to tell. And this is the place to do that. After our last meeting, I got a phone call about 6 that afternoon, right after dinner, from an 82-year-old man who was in the audience. I didn't know him at the time. He's been a professor at Harvard for 100 years, and he was very young and in the Army and in Europe in 1945. He was trained, he was actually a Russian speaking because his mother spoke Russian, and he was trained as a group of people that were to meet the Russians as they came together. He didn't actually do that, but he was involved with a lot of interesting things, and he wanted to tell his story, which is what I'm getting to. He was actually at the Nuremberg trial for several days as a witness, sitting in the back row watching what goes on here. Kind of a window to the past. So if you know somebody that has a story to tell, maybe somebody that has to get it out or wants to get it out, please let us know. Those of us on the committee, which is about 8 of us, always have our eyes and ears open. That's how we get such good speakers. But you all might do the same thing. If somebody wants to tell a story, let us know about it, and we'll end up having to speak here. Jerry O'Neill is a very nice young woman sitting over here who baked some cookies for us today. If anybody has the urge to bake some cookies, please do that and bring them. And those that we don't use, although use go very quickly, we'll put them in the freezer and use them for the next meeting. Thank you very much. Jerry Tishler was a young lawyer in the Army, just about the year of Tet, that is 1968, and getting ready to be sent into Vietnam, and all of a sudden he was sent up into Korea. And he was involved in the legal aspects of the Pueblo tragedy. And he's going to speak to us about that today. And Jerry, if you will, Jerry Tishler.
Thanks very much, Bill. Hi, everyone. It's amazing, isn't it, that I'm speaking about North Korea today in light of what happened yesterday. This lecture that I prepared, some 6 or 8 months ago for another veterans group is actually fairly long, very detailed, involves some legalistic issues and some technical issues, and I'm very willing to answer questions, but I'm going to run through it fairly quickly and invite you to interrupt anytime you want. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions, especially if I'm not clear about something. But the parallels between what happened yesterday and what happened in January of 1968 are mind-boggling, both in terms of United States intelligence, that is to say our intelligence services, and the United States response to North Korea, and the United States understanding of North Korea. Now on the projector now, you see a picture of the USS Pueblo in 1967 when it was commissioned, or I should say recommissioned. It was actually a World War II vessel that was pulled out of storage, that and another vessel, and recommissioned by and on behalf of the National Security Agency. It was being fitted as a spy ship. The next slide, Charlie, is another photograph of the Pueblo. This time you see it many years later, in 1999, 40 years later, in Wonsan Harbor. It's a museum now. Ever since January 22nd, 1968, it has been in the custody and possession of North Korea. The first in United States history for this ever to happen. A real tragedy, and obviously a moving symbol. The next slide is a photograph on Time magazine shortly after the Pueblo was captured of Lloyd Boucher, who had just been promoted to commander, full commander from lieutenant commander, and was the skipper of the Pueblo. That photograph was reconstructed from an official Navy photograph that had been provided to Time by his wife. The next photograph is a picture of Boucher after he had been released. 70 pounds lighter, a lot thinner, and a lot wiser. Boucher had been at once praised and at once vilified. The Navy had its view of Boucher, the public had its view of Boucher, but after so many years, and after the declassification of everything I knew and much more that I didn't know, it's obvious today that Boucher was, he's passed away now, a genuine hero. He was so regarded by every member of his crew and was ultimately, although unfortunately belatedly, so decorated. Let's go to the next slide, please, and introduce ourselves to North Korea. I'm not going to give you a full history of the Korean Peninsula. You know, I'm sure, of your own knowledge, what happened at the end of the hot war in Korea, that there was no treaty, by the way. No treaty has ever been entered into between Korea and the United States. There was a truce. And the truce lined up North Korea and South Korea on either side of the 38th parallel at a village called Panmunjom. And since that time in 1954 to the present, both sides have been meeting, sometimes regularly, more often irregularly. But the fighting over the DMZ has gone on all of these years. When I was first assigned to Korea, which was in July 1967, we had 50,000 troops there. 67. That's 22 years after the truce between Korea and the United States. Now let's fast forward to 2006. Now we have 38,000 troops there. How many years now have gone by? More than half a century. And we're still on this Korean peninsula with no apparent progress between us and North Korea, and very little progress between South and North Korea. The way the command was organized, well, I suppose I should tell you about my own assignment, because that will give you an insight. I had been on orders to Vietnam, and three of us judge advocates, we were all newly commissioned judge advocates. I was 27 years old, I guess. Were transferred from, our orders were changed, and we were transferred to Korea. My assignment was dual. I was assigned to the 8th Army Headquarters Staff Judge Advocate Office. We had a 4-star general named Charles H. Bonesteel commanding the 8th Army. We had 2 combat divisions in Korea, both on the DMZ, and we had a lot of other support units attached to 8th Army. There's a member in the audience who I just saw a moment ago in the men's room who told me that he was in Incheon at that time in a procurement slot. So we were spread out through Korea. 8th Army headquarters was in Seoul in a place called Yongsan Compound. The 2 division headquarters, each headed by a 2-star general, obviously were on the DMZ. And there was a corps between the divisions and the 8th Army headquarters called I Corps, and that was headed by a 3-star general. Separate from that, and this is germane to what happened yesterday, there was a completely different command in Korea, headed this time by a 2-star American general. It was called the United Nations Command. You see, Korea in 1950 was a United Nations effort, a genuine United Nations effort, the first of its kind since the United Nations was formed. And in fact, when I served in Korea, there were troops from, I never got a count, but I'm thinking 8 or 9 other countries minimum. And they were present, and they were combat troops. And there were officers and enlisted men who were part of the United Nations Command headquarters itself. So I had one foot in 8th Army as a judge advocate, and my other foot was in the United Nations Command as the Assistant International Affairs Officer for that command. Fortunately, the International Affairs Officer knew a hell of a lot more than I did. He was a career judge advocate with great advanced training in international relations and international law. A fellow named Kelly, a terrific guy. In any event, in those days, the North was way ahead of the South in its military readiness. I know that would surprise you. But South Korea in the mid-60s was desolate, it was undeveloped. As a matter of fact, when they had the Olympics in Seoul a few years ago and I saw the photographs, of the pictures rather, on television, I was blown away by how much, at least superficially, the country has changed. But in those days, North Korea was clearly the more powerful of the two entities. But there constantly were problems. The present president of South Korea's father, Kim Jong-il was his name, was the dictator of North Korea. He didn't have the same reputation as the current president, as being a wacko and shrewd, but in a eccentric sense. This guy was a killer. He was completely paranoid. And he was prepared to do anything and everything to enhance the honor of North Korea. That's something that the United States intelligence agencies never really grasped, as I'll illustrate as we go on. In any event, just to give you an idea of the fighting that took place in the mid-1960s between North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. I've noted here that in 1964, a U.S. helicopter was downed, and the two pilots were captured, and they were held for 1 year. We, the United States, had to apologize for, quote, invading North Korean airspace, end quote, in order to get them back. To my knowledge, they were not tortured or mistreated while they were in custody. A parallel that happened in Vietnam, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, is that there were two destroyers on reconnaissance missions, both in effect spy ships. They were thought to be fired on by North Vietnam torpedo boats. That started the Gulf of Tonkin, and that started the Vietnam War. This is just to place it in historical context. So we had at the same time in 1964 two areas heating up. We had been in Vietnam since the French left in 1954, but only in very limited circumstances. We had been much more obvious and in much larger measures in Korea. April of 1965, North Korean MiGs attack a bomber on recon. Recon was a euphemism for an intelligence mission. The plane was destroyed, its crew killed. On October 13th, Kim Il-sung, the president, makes a speech which is broadcast ultimately all over the world, in which he says he's going to reunify the peninsula by force if necessary. We didn't take him at his word, just like we didn't take his son at his word a few years ago. In 1966, there were 50 incidents. Incidents means firing over the DMZ or actual incursions by North Korean commandos. Look at how it went up in 1967, my first year there. 543, more than tenfold. The next slide, please. Before I got to Korea, ROK stands for Republic of Korea. That means South Korea. A South Korean naval vessel was sunk by artillery. The coastal waters of North Korea were extremely heavily fortified. I don't know the expression in the Air Force for groups of planes, what the organizational expression is. I'm thinking wings, but I may be wrong on that. Correct me if I am. But there were hundreds and hundreds of fighter planes, most of them Russian-made MiGs, within a few miles of the coastal waters of North Vietnam. There was also heavy artillery batteries set there. So, as far as we know, the naval vessel was on just on a patrol, a normal patrol, in international waters and was sunk. Let me digress. There's been a controversy in international law for hundreds of years about what international waters are. The United States has taken the position that when it comes to our waters, it's 12 miles. When it comes to anybody else's waters, it's 3 miles. In reality, the accepted definition, and the definition that I'll use for this lecture, as it were, is 12 miles. So when I say that a ship is in international waters, that means it's more than 12 nautical miles from a coastline, or the nearest coastline. Next, in 1967, North Korea captured 50 Korean fishing boats. These were not subterfuge intelligence vessels. These were fishing boats. Fishing was one of the primary livelihoods of South Korea at that time. As you can see, there were direct confrontations with more than 100 Allied troops, including U.S. troops, killed. The most severe attack in 1967, which occurred shortly after I got there, was that 2 U.S. barracks, these were barracks in one of the divisions, I think the 7th Division, near the DMZ, were attacked by North Koreans and 21 casualties. I don't know how many did. In any event, there were, at that time, many intelligence agencies in the United States, just as there are now. There was something at that time called a Special National Intelligence Estimate. It may not be called that now, but it's substantially the same thing, an aggregation of recommendations and facts and findings from various other intelligence agencies. The 8th Army and the Joint Chiefs of Staff Recon Center advised the National Security Agency of this extreme sensitivity of North Korea on its coastline. That's the background for what happened. The next slide, please. On one of my first visits to the DMZ, before the Pueblo was captured, this sign was posted. I took this picture. These were published everywhere. We were desperately seeking intelligence from South Korean farmers primarily, who would see North Korean commandos coming across our lines at night. And as I hope I'll have a chance to describe to you, I tried a court-martial in Korea when I was there that involved a classified night detection device that we finally got operational so that we could basically see at night. Now you can go into a Cabela's catalog and probably buy one for $100. But in those days it was extremely highly classified and sophisticated. But until we got that equipment there, nighttime was pitch black. The 38th parallel, the DMZ, was very long, and agents would sneak across. Yes?
But already in 1950, they had infrared equipment.
They had infrared equipment, that's right. But that's detectable by North Korea. What I'm referring to is something called a starlight scope. A starlight scope will, without detecting, without emitting a signal, will illuminate, even in the pitch black, and give pretty good resolution. In those days it wasn't perfect, today it is perfect. Now let me just do the next slide if I can, please. Just a quick contrast between North Korea then and now. I told you that Kim Il-sung was less erratic, but no less dangerous than his son Kim Jong-il. There was a concept in the Korean culture called jushe. I'm spelling it phonetically there. Jushe. It meant the honor of a country. This is the most important component of North Korean, in fact, frankly, South Korean culture as well. we, just as we're somewhat oblique initially in our understanding of Muslim culture and how the difficulties we get into in Iraq because of our obliqueness at that, so too were we oblique about the meaning and the actionable conduct that can arise from the concept of juche. In the name of juche, hundreds of thousands have been killed. Juche is still a concept today that is alive and well and operative in North Korea, and is the underlying motivation, in my view, for the recent nuclear test. The notion of North Korean honor, North Korean place in society. Now, the United States then, and we know this because we have thousands upon thousands of declassified records, didn't interpret the threats that were directly communicated by Kim Il-sung as anything but propaganda. Didn't take it seriously. Just to skim through the rest of this, we had a problem that was emerging and evolving in Vietnam that was, and you see the analogy here between Iraq and Afghanistan. Vietnam was occupying our primary focus in the military. Most of our active duty combat troops were there and not in Korea. And as a consequence, both because of our failure to understand North Korean culture and our other obligations, and the ambiguity especially of our other obligations, we didn't notice what was evolving in Korea. The next slide, please. The Navy worked with the NSA in their intelligence programs. There were two ships that were recommissioned, two very small World War II vessels that were recommissioned. One was the Banner and the other was the Pueblo. And they both were given top secret crypto missions by the National Security Agency to go near the coastlines in international waters of the Soviet Union and North Korea to collect signal intelligence. Now, the Soviets had been doing this to us for many, many years with their trawlers. You probably remember that. We never fired on the trawlers. Our naval vessels never harassed them. We only would come near them if they made an incursion within the 12-mile zone. And the Banner experienced a little more harassment by the Soviets, but no attempted boarding and no firing upon. So the Banner was in the process of completing its mission in Soviet waters. The program that both the Banner and the Pueblo were involved in was called the AGER, A-G-E-R program. That was a euphemism for Auxiliary General Environmental Research. One of the problems that the Pueblo had, which I'll illustrate momentarily, is that this was such a highly classified program that when the ship was being retrofitted for its intelligence mission in Bremerton Shipyard in Washington, even the commanding officer of the shipyard wasn't permitted to know the purpose of the retrofitting. There were only two people at that time physically present at Bremerton, Commander Boucher and his executive officer, who had clearance. Yes, sir?
I think you're talking about the previous slide.
You're right, but I don't want to be slipping back and forth or it's going to confuse both me and Charlie. Okay, yeah, let me see if I am. I think I probably got the wrong. Put the next slide on. Yeah, that's the slide I'm referring to. And that slide that you had, Charlie, just, was it number 8? Sorry. I came prepared to do overhead slides like this, and the library has such sophisticated equipment that we didn't quite marry up together. But I don't really like slides that much anyway, and we're not going to be covering a great deal by the slides. I think if you could do this for me, Charlie, if you could go to slide 7. It's a picture. This is what it looks like. We'll go right fast forward to that. This is when the Pueblo was commissioned, 11 May 1967, 2 months before I was to arrive in Korea. Briefly, the history of the Pueblo: it was launched in April of 1944 as a supply vessel. It was an Army boat. It was for the Army Transportation Corps. Those of you who were in the Navy, I'll give you the dimensions. My understanding is that it was extremely small for a naval vessel. 176 feet long. The beam, that is the width, was only 33 feet. The displacement was 935 tons. It was designed to hold a crew, complete crew, of no more than 50. It sailed with 83. 33, I think it was, 33 of the personnel on board the Pueblo, when it finally set out, were intelligence technicians. Some were Navy, there were a few were in Marine Corps. None of them, not a single person in that unit, reported to Captain Boucher. It's one of the very few times in naval history when there was a split command on the boat, and that caused very serious problems later on, as between communications between the bridge and what was going on that the intelligence people knew about below deck. Let's go to slide 6, Charlie, if you have it. It's titled Mission and Resources. Have we got that?
Yep.
Good. This ship was a wreck. The steering unit problems happened constantly. Because it couldn't be considered a priority at Bremerton Shipyard, that was retrofitting ships for Vietnam service, because no one was supposed to know what it was going to do. The fitting of the ship was always delayed. There were huge problems in getting the damn thing to even run. What was most troubling is that the armaments on the ship were grossly inadequate. Boucher, who knew the mission, of course, tried to argue for much heavier armaments in the event there was a confrontation. What ultimately was done is that a 50 caliber machine gun was mounted on the deck. But the orders that I will show you in a minute, the actual orders, required that that machine gun be covered with a tarpaulin. Now, when you go into the sea in the middle of winter in North Korea, that tarpaulin freezes like New Hampshire Lake. So they would have to chip away at the ice to remove the tarpaulin and then load the machine gun and then man it in order to get access to it. That was the only significant heavy armament, and that's a 50 caliber machine gun, which is, on a tank, for example, the second heaviest armament. It's not really a cannon. The only other weapons they had were 45 caliber model 1911 pistols and Tommy guns, and those were below decks in a locker, physically locked. We'll come to the difficulty in getting those arms out and ready when the boarding took place by North Korea in a few minutes. Boucher asked for destruction devices because this was a multi-intelligence agency mission, and some 5 or 6 agencies sent classified documents to be actually kept on the ship. Hundreds of thousands of pages of classified documents, many of them completely unnecessary, many of them duplicative. In addition, on the ship was carried the 201 files of every single person, the personnel files of every sailor and Marine on the ship. So Boucher, being very concerned in his preparations, asked for destruction devices. Well, you know, you can go into Staples today for $50 and buy a shredder. What he was given was an incinerator, which it might have taken 3 weeks to incinerate everything that they had to incinerate, if they could find it and get it. They had maybe 3 minutes to do it before it was boarded. There's a written record of Boucher's requests, the way they went up the chain of command, the equivocating and the ultimate denial of most of his requests. One reason why after the capture and after what happened during their capture, the Navy closed ranks against Boucher. Ultimately, an admiral was recommended for court-martial who was responsible for this screw-up. But that didn't help the crew while they were in North Korea. As you can see from the other indicia on the slide, conditions were very crowded, and the risk assessment that is given to every mission, in whatever branch of the service you were in, if you were in combat, you knew, especially in intelligence missions, that there was a risk assessment given, and you were manned and given armaments in accordance with the risk assessment. Well, there was a disagreement about the risk assessment in this particular case, and it never reached the proper level, and the mission started out with a low risk assessment. The next order, the next slide, are excerpts from the actual orders. Now, these were so classified when I was there. I didn't have a high enough, I don't think anyone except maybe a half a dozen people in Korea could see these orders when I was there. So I saw them for the first time when I was preparing for this lecture, and I was astonished by them because they validate everything that the crew and Boucher had stated many years before. Item A1, the mission was to determine the nature and extent of the naval activity in the vicinity of North Korea, specifically the port of Wonsan, and Wonsan Harbor is near where the Pueblo was captured. The ship was to sample the electronic environment of the east coast of North Korea and fix on coastal radar. The next slide, as I stated before, estimated the risk at minimal, since Pueblo will be operating in international waters for the entire deployment. Excuse me? I don't know that Kim Il-jung would respect international waters, but can you imagine assessing a minimal risk with a spy ship that was laden with the most sophisticated electronic equipment we had in the government at that time, operating 13, 14 miles off the coast of North Korea with just the background I've given you now? You'll see as we develop this that there were direct threats against the Pueblo by North Korea, and an extremely hostile act which almost started another Korean war 3 days before the Pueblo was captured. And still the Navy let the Pueblo sail along a few miles outside the international limits. Now the next order is classic military. The next slide please, Charlie. Can you believe that? Direct liaison by the Pueblo with the director of the Naval Security Group in the Pacific Command Electronic Intelligence Center, and so on and so forth, the commander of U.S. forces in Korea. In other words, 6 higher headquarters, all of them with 3- and 4-star officers. This was supposed to be conducted by this ship with 80 people sailing off the coast of Korea with all of these groups of headquarters. The next slide makes clear that this would have been impossible for them to do. It was impossible for them to do. You can see the order in B, the asterisk B. Are we on the right slide? Yeah. CPA to CORCOM, Soviet landmass, offshore islands will be 13 nautical miles. That says that the ship is required to be no closer to the closest point of land than 13 miles. And then the last line, E, do not interfere with Soviet exercises, because from Korea, the Pueblo was supposed to follow the banner and surveil the Soviet Union. The last part of the orders is the most interesting. The next slide, please. I told you about the armament or lack of armament that the ship had. If you look at H, I don't know what injalled means, that might be a typo, but maybe installed or something like that. Defensive armament should be stowed or covered in such a manner as to not elicit unusual interest from surveyed units. Employ only in cases where threat to survival is obvious. So here we find the Pueblo in freezing cold winter in the middle of the ocean, 13 miles or farther from the coast of North Korea. Its 50 caliber machine gun is below a tarpaulin that's frozen to the deck. Its pistols and its Tommy guns, its sidearms, its handguns, are stowed below decks in a locked locker. And by the way, no one on the crew had ever been trained to even fire a 50 caliber machine gun. When I was in tank training, I fired them. Let us just say it's not a weapon of extreme nuanced accuracy. It requires a lot of training. It's very loud, very big, a heavy recoil, and the only exercise I'm aware of that they did is that one day when they were setting out, they put out drums on the water to see if anybody could hit it, and anything beyond 50 or 60 yards they couldn't hit. 50 or 60 yards. All right, now, the next slide shows what was extremely dramatic, and that is the Blue House attack. In South Korea, their White House is called the Blue House. There was a foreshadowing of what was going to happen in the North Korean press. The North Korean government had made threats about U.S. spy ships. Japanese papers who carried the North Korean press to the Western world noted that the threat was specific to the USS Pueblo. Look at the date of that, January 11th, 1968. On January 19th, 68, 30 North Korean commandos entered South Korea in order to assassinate President Park Chung-hee. Park Chung-hee was a general during the Korean War, a very popular Korean leader. He had been president, well, this was 67, he'd been president ever since 54, and he was to remain president for some years thereafter. Now, these North Koreans snuck over the DMZ at night, and interestingly, they came upon a group of South Korean woodcutters. And this is verified later in many accounts. And instead of killing the woodcutters, they simply asked them to remain silent and not give away their whereabouts. And they proceeded on to Seoul. Remember, they're coming from north to south, but it's not very far. It's about 30 miles. Well, obviously, one of the woodcutters let on that this was in progress. And the South Korean police, not the South Korean army, and not the American army, the South Korean police intercepted many of this squadron of commandos very close to the Blue House. I don't know if 1,000 yards from the Blue House, and killed many of them, captured the rest. Now, this happens on January 21st, 1968. Mark the date with me now. A CT, in the next line, stands for Communications Technician. I told you there were about 30 intelligence technicians in the hold of the USS Pueblo. One of them heard a broadcast about the raid on the Blue House. That information never reached Boucher on the bridge. Different chain of command. This young soldier, young sailor, could have been a teenager, didn't have any contextual sense. He may not have even reported it to the NCO who was in charge of him. The point is, nobody on the crew itself of the Pueblo, neither the commander nor anyone else, knew of this event. And no one told them directly. with all of the headquarters to which they were supposed to report, the highest headquarters in the Pacific, no direct transmission of what happened on January 21st, 1968 ever went to Commander Boucher. Now, South Korea went nuts when this happened. They wanted to go to war immediately. Again, we have not only the incursion, but the honor, the assassination of frankly, their war hero, their greatest president, Park Chung-hee, or the near assassination. President Johnson was extremely upset. I show a picture of him later, and I'll read something that was written that he wrote. It was his worst day in office, bottom line. The U.S. reaction was one of shock. But we had other fish to fry in Vietnam. It was immediately thought that this was concerted. That is to say, that there was possibly a concerted effort between Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and or the Viet Cong, and the North Korea, so that one would be distracted from the other. And what gave rise to this proposition, this hypothesis later, a few weeks later, was the initiation of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. That turned out to be not true. Absolutely not true. Another lesson we learned about North Korea, it doesn't take orders from anybody. It doesn't coordinate with anybody. The Russians were very upset about this. The Chinese were very upset. I'm not talking about yesterday. I'm talking about what happened in 1967, or 68, excuse me. But these kinds of judgments on our part, this rush to judgment that is a coordinated kind of thing, misled us into not acting quickly enough to save the crew. In any event, do I have the next slide? It's number 17. I don't recall if I asked you, Charlie. I'm sorry. 2 days later, again, completely being devoid of any knowledge of what happened 2 days earlier, a North Korean subchaser came very close to the Pueblo, and all of its crew were at battle stations. Anybody in the Navy can tell us what battle stations are?
Well, you're at full alert. You go to your duty stations, whether it's machine guns or cannons, whatever. You're at war. You're ready to go to war.
Okay, and that's exactly what happened. Then followed 3 torpedo boats that came alongside the Pueblo. And if that wasn't enough, there were overflights by fully armed MiGs directly over the Pueblo. The Pueblo checked its position. It was in international waters. It started to go out to sea. At that time, one of the North Korean boats started firing machine guns and automatic cannons at the Pueblo. Several crew members were hit. One was killed. Boucher was hit. Boucher then ordered document destruction. So the fire of the little furnace was initiated, and I don't know what, a ream of paper maybe was destroyed before the boarding actually occurred. It wasn't very successful. And of course, the 201 files, the personnel files I told you about, were not the highest priority to destroy, although they should have been, and they were kept intact. There was further North Korean fire. I'm compressing here what I could do in 20 minutes to tell you about all of the events that happened, but I'll try to go quickly because there's a lot more to discuss. The ship was boarded by North Korean soldiers. No effort, I can't say no effort was made, but any effort that was made to obtain the small arms in the locker below was unavailing. I don't know if any effort was made, but it was never ordered by Captain Boucher. And there was a what Boucher subsequently called a modified battle stations. But things happened so quickly, and the shooting was so violent, and the boarding was so quick that the crew couldn't react. The crew was then, there was additional engagements and additional firing until finally the boat was boarded. The men were lined up, our men were lined up, and the boat was ordered to follow one of the North Korean boats into Wonsan Harbor. And this is the historical reference I was trying to think of before. For what it's worth, it was the first time since 1807 when and it's the only the second time in U.S. history when a hostile force was permitted to board a U.S. carrier. What's interesting for a lawyer, and when I talk about the court-martials later, I'll explain this to you. There's a United States Navy regulation. It's pretty obvious, but it's a written regulation and has been since the Revolutionary War, that no captain can surrender his ship as long as he has the means to resist. Think about that. And think about what you would have done had you been in Boucher's place at that time and what he reasonably could have done. But I'm not making a case for that here. That requires you to understand a lot more facts, and that's the subject really of a different lecture. Can we go to the next tape, please? The next slide. That's a picture that I took it was either late January or early February, when again I was on the DMZ. And the 8th Army Command had a very different posture at that point. We were required, even staff officers like myself were required to wear flak vests, carry sidearms. It was a very uptight scenario. We were very, very short-handed. Both of our divisions were under strength, both in personnel and in equipment. When I talk about the U.S. response to the capture, you'll see that the Air Force units that were there were not configured for conventional warfare, let me put it that way. I'll explain a little more later. So we were in tough shape, but we had to go on alert immediately. And then, as you know, when did Tet occur? Was that February? Anybody know? Remember? It was a few weeks later. The Tet Offensive occurred in Vietnam. And that abated the news of the Pueblo a little bit. But let's go to the next slide and tell you what the military responses were. Now, in South Korea, under the command of General Bonesteel, there was a couple of Air Force, I'm going to call them units because I'm not sure what the actual description of the unit is. They were F-4s. They had racks on them for nuclear arms. They could not be retrofitted for conventional arms quickly enough to respond. Remember, what's happening now is that let's assume this is happening 14 miles off the North Korean shore of Wonsan Harbor. The boat is proceeding, the flotilla of boats, the North Korean boats and the Pueblo, are proceeding to Wonsan. That doesn't take very long. The crew deboards the Pueblo and is met immediately with beatings and worse. And so maybe a half hour has happened since the actual boarding, or an hour at the most. U.S. warplanes can't react quickly enough. Whether they actually had nuclear missiles on the racks, I don't know, but they had nuclear racks. The closest fighters that were properly configured were in Okinawa. It was too far away. Japan, where the principal Air Force command was for the northern Pacific, responded with 12 fighters, but it was too late. And furthermore, because it was considered a low-risk mission, these fighters were never put on alert, so they had to move from scratch. I mentioned before, the armaments that North Korea had at Wonsan were mind-boggling. They had 75 MiGs loaded and ready to go at Wonsan. So if we had come over there with 12 fighters, we would have been history. Now, I don't know whether or not we knew what the full complement of MiGs were at Wonsan, but that was one of the reasons the Pueblo was in the water, to find that out. Now, the USS Enterprise was on its way to Vietnam, and it had combat-ready fighter aircraft on board. But it had never been alerted to the fact that the Pueblo even existed. And it was 500 miles away en route to the Philippines, where it was going to spend a few days, and then en route to Vietnam. It actually turned around, came back, and then turned around again. Okay, this happened on January 23rd, Korea time. That same day, you remember these people, McNamara, Rusk, Bundy, Rostow, they met. They were pushing hard for a response, and a military response. There were further meetings that they had with General Wheeler. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as I recall at the time, General Taylor, Paul Nietzsche, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, or maybe he was the Secretary of Defense, Paul Warnke, Helms of CIA, and Clark Clifford. The next day, Secretary of State Rusk announced that it was an act of war, which it obviously was. And the following day, President Johnson called up the reserves. The next slide, please. A photograph of President Johnson giving a presentation to members of Congress on the Pueblo. Here is what LBJ wrote in his autobiography. If I had to pick a day that symbolized the turmoil we experienced throughout 1968, I think January 23 would be the day, the morning the Pueblo was seized. The country was completely unprepared for this. Completely unprepared, psychologically and militarily. Let's continue with the military responses. The next slide, please. Page 20. Arthur Goldberg subsequently became a Supreme Court justice, was the ambassador to the United Nations. Remember, I told you at the very beginning that this was a United Nations operation from the beginning, from day one, and a good one and a viable one. So the proper forum wasn't debated like it is now vis-a-vis Iraq. The proper forum was the United Nations, and he was a strong and forceful and respected ambassador. They met. They issued a resolution ultimately, which was ignored by North Korea. General Bonesteel, who was a brilliant, extremely competent general, was very concerned, however, that this now would precipitate another major Korean war. The Republic of Korea, ROK stands for Republic of Korea, the South Koreans were still very miffed about the Blue House raid, and they wanted to go in combat immediately against North Korea. And I had lunch with Tim. Where's Tim? Tim served in Vietnam, and he reminded me that there was a unit of South Korean soldiers, a very important unit of actually it was a division strength unit. I don't know but they had about 30,000 soldiers in Vietnam. South Korea did, and it was an important ally to us. And Bonesteel was very concerned with a larger picture of what would happen if, in light of the insult to South Korea with the Blue House raid, in light of the insult to the United States with the capture of the Pueblo, if we took no action at all, would South Korea pull its troops out of Vietnam? Would there be a real serious international problem? At the same time, he was well aware of intelligence that in effect provided that North Korea, in a firefight with South Korea, would probably prevail at this time. We were very under strength. We had the nuclear capability. Obviously, we're not going to use it when we're only when we're so close to a friendly border, if not for that reason alone. Here, January 30th, 1968, I thought it was February, the Tet Offensive occurred. This was a complete surprise, unfortunately, to our our forces, to our leadership, our military leadership in the United States, even though there were, in retrospect at least, indicia that that would happen. So if you remember, I remember it very clearly, the focus was very much on Vietnam at that time. So South Korea was put on hold. Now, what happened in the ensuing weeks is that the number of aircraft, both South Korean aircraft and U.S. aircraft and Allied aircraft, built up very much in Korea. And the U.S. divisions we had there, which I see from my notes were 70% strength, which wasn't unusual, were drawn up immediately to full strength. But I remember distinctly that we had a problem with supplies, we had a problem with logistics, we had a problem with armaments. We had to divert an awful lot of materiel that was en route from other locations to Vietnam back to Korea. Ultimately, President Johnson decided, and it's reflected in the next slide, along with McNamara and Helms, that they would not take military action against North Korea. Now, what could they have done? We can speculate about that. By the time it was possible to take military action, the crew of the Pueblo had been moved, obviously, from Wonsan Harbor. The ship was still there. In retrospect, what should have been done is that they should have bombed the ship. And they should have done it very quickly, because the material on the ship in 1967 was absolutely the most classified material we had in the government. And anything that the North Koreans did not understand, they sent to the Soviet Union for interpretation. And as I'm going to explain later on, many years later, when one of the worst spies in the history of this country was finally apprehended, he allowed as that this was the greatest loss of U.S. intelligence in history, that it had been used for years and years. And remember, not only the equipment, but all of the manuals, all of the classified documents, they were all intact. Moving on. I think the next slide talks about further military responses, but I'm going to skip that. I don't have time. Let's go back to the home front. The next slide after that, which is number 26, Charlie, is a picture of Rose Boucher, who was in many ways a stereotypical military wife, very shy, very retiring, who suddenly found her voice. And I didn't know this because I was there at the time, but bumper stickers were made and passed out so that nobody would forget the crew was still there. Let's talk about what happened to the crew. The next slide, please. Now, we talked today about being careful to ensure that we comply with the Geneva Conventions, lest our troops would be captured and an opposing force would not comply. This is a very familiar, resonating principle, I'm sure, to all of you. Well, in fact, from the second they debarked the boat, they were tortured, brutally tortured. Let me just say there's a website, the USS Pueblo website. There's testimony by virtually every member of the crew about what happened to that individual person. It's a very chilling experience to read their stories about what happened to them and how they were treated. Now, Boucher made a decision, a very difficult decision, one that he probably regretted many times, but he did it in good faith. He made a decision to capitulate, but not to turn coat. Let me explain what I mean. They were being tortured immediately. Bones were being broken. Limbs were being cut off. he was told that his men would be paraded in front of him one by one and shot in his presence until he relented and gave more than his name, rank, and serial number. One of the problems is that they had his 201 file. They had everybody's 201 file. They knew everything about them. You remember when we were in the service, the first thing you learn is the duty of a soldier. General Marshall was the one who hand wrote this out. Only you give your name, rank, and serial number. Well, in certain circumstances, we learn that that's not practical or possible, and this was one of those circumstances. So after a day and a half of continual torture, Boucher broke. But he broke in a way that saved his dignity and that communicated to the world that no one had in fact turned-coded. Let me explain what they did. They used, the North Koreans, it was almost comical. They weren't culturally attuned to the United States very well. Their command of English was technically correct, but the nuances, the slang wasn't known to them. So that some of the confessions that they tried to elicit from the men were written in double talk, in pidgin English. And these confessions made their way to the United States, and it was obvious to any reader in the United States what was going on here. There was something that, in fact, let me read you Boucher's confession. This will be a good illustration. Here's part of his confession. I am Commander Lloyd Mark Boucher, captain of the USS Pueblo, who was captured while carrying out espionage activities after intruding deep into the territorial waters of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency promised me that if this task would be done successfully, a lot of dollars would be offered to all crew members of my ship. Particularly, I myself would be honored. I have no excuse whatsoever for my criminal acts. The crime committed by me and my men is entirely indelible. Wrong choice of words. A lot of dollars, indelible. This was a confession he made after the 50 confessions he first tried to make were rejected by his handler. Here's the confession of the crew. We, as conscientious human beings who were cast upon the rocks and shoals of immorality by the tidal wave of Washington's naughty policies, know that neither the frequency nor the distance of the transgressions into Korean waters matter, because in the final analysis, penetration, however slight, is sufficient to complete the act. Have an idea where that came from? Let's go to the next slide, please. There were press conferences like the Jane Fonda kind of conferences that you remember from Vietnam, where the crew, the ones who were not too physically damaged to show to the world, were paraded. Next slide, please. This slide that I'm about to show you now made the front page of the New York Times. Look at what the sailor, second from the bottom right, is doing with his right hand. That the crew called when asked by the North Korean captors, "What are you doing?" "Oh, that's the Hawaiian good luck sign." When that was reprinted in Time magazine, unfortunately, the reporter called attention to the fact that he was giving the finger to his captors. And the crew, even though they were getting close to being released at this time, went through something called Hell Week because they embarrassed their handlers. I'll read you just an excerpt. Almost every prisoner was severely beaten during Hell Week. A few were singled out as special targets. Monroe Goldman, James Layton, and Howard Bland, the three who had made the finger gesture in the photo, attracted special interest. Goldman, who had served on a minesweeper that mined Wonsan Harbor during the Korean War, emerged from one beating with his ear almost torn off the side of his head. And then there's further description of the Hell Week in which, and this is literally a month or so before they were going to be released, everyone was beaten so badly. Go to the next slide, please. During Hell Week, it came, unfortunately, that there was one collaborator among the crew. I won't give you the full details of how he collaborated and what he did. Interestingly, I've read a great deal about this just in the last year or so, and nowhere in any of the literature that I've reviewed can I find his name. I could only do it if I was really fixated on it and kind of rule out all the other names. I don't know who he was, and they never released his name. The crew, the captain, no one ever released his name, but they threatened to kill him. The crew did, our crew did, and they would have. Bush's leadership, I can't emphasize enough. I've read every account by every member of the crew. Busher was a hero. He took the worst punishment of anyone. He bore it with the most dignity, and he rallied the crew. Yes, he can be faulted for not using all means to resist. He can be faulted, in theory, for this so-called confession. All of that's true. No one's perfect. No one has a unidimensional character. But he is and was a hero. Now, they were released on December 23rd, 11 months to the day after they were captured, by virtue of a solution, it sounds ridiculous, by someone in the State Department named Leonard. What North Korea wanted all along, and they said they would release our men as soon as we did it, they wanted an admission that we were within their territorial waters, which was of course not true. They wanted an apology, and they wanted an assurance, the AAAs it was called, admission, apology, assurance that it would never happen again. Well, for 11 months, these men were beaten and tortured and starved while the government deliberated on how to handle this. Finally, a fellow named Leonard, whose name I never heard before and I've never heard since, some mid-level bureaucrat in the State Department came up with a solution that they would sign something and then immediately disavow it. And they did. They signed what lawyers call a disclaimer. At 9 o'clock in the morning of December 3rd, General Woodward took a seat at the round table. This is in Panmunjom. He nodded to Pak. Pak is his opposite number, and in a clear, strong voice began reading the statement suggested by a Maryland housewife. Actually, it was Mrs. Leonard who suggested it to her husband. The position of the United States government with regard to the Pueblo has been that the ship was not engaged in illegal activity, that there is no convincing evidence that the ship at any time intruded into the territorial waters claimed by North Korea, and that we could not apologize for actions which we did not believe took place. The document which I am going to sign was prepared by the North Koreans and is at variance with the above position. My signature will not and cannot alter the facts. I will sign the document to free the crew and only to free the crew. And they were freed. Well, what was the reaction of the country to this? I'll give you one reaction. You try to figure out who the author of this was. This letter, he said, was far worse than anything I ever confessed to in my many confrontations. And he, meaning General Woodward, was permitted to make that statement without being tortured, and here we're being tortured to prevent ourselves from saying even less. We felt really bad at that. We wondered in our own minds, was it worth all that we took to keep from making statements? That was written by John McCain from Hanoi. So you see, nothing really is simple in this business. Let's go to the next slide, please. The slide of Newsweek magazine. Who's to blame? Naturally, we get our men back in the condition we found them, in this terrible condition, and the first thing is the blame game. So Newsweek has a photograph of Boucher, 70 pounds lighter, 60 pounds lighter, he's wearing, I think, a Purple Heart there. I think he'd been given a Purple Heart by then. Who is to blame? Now the next magazine is Life. I never thought of Life as a thoughtful magazine particularly, but the headline reflects some thought, the cruel dilemmas of duty. At least they're recognizing that it's a dilemma, that it's not a simple, easy solution. Now let's go to the next slide. Here I can really be guided by you. I can tell you about some of my own experiences there, including United States versus Hunter, which is the court-martial that I tried. I can tell you about the consequences of this, where the program itself was discontinued. I can tell you what happened in 1969, less than 2 years later, when an EC-121 was downed by North Korea. An EC-121 is a low-altitude recon, a spy plane basically. It was 50 miles off the coast. The CINCPAC, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, Admiral Sharp, urged massive retaliation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff readied the naval and air strikes. Kissinger, in his autobiography and before that, strongly recommended to Nixon that there be retaliation. We didn't retaliate. So in other words, here, once again, we have the leader of North Korea doing a provocative, illegal act, shooting down a plane 50 miles off its coast, and there's no reaction by the United States. Now, with that culture embedded in North Korea, is there any reason to believe that they would not have discharged the nuclear test yesterday? What possible disincentive was it for them? Well, there was a court of inquiry. A court of inquiry is a legal proceeding applicable to all branches of service in which sworn testimony is taken. If you remember the Uniform Code of Military Justice, it's like an Article 32 proceeding, but it's a little broader than that. Some 5 or 7 admirals sat on this inquiry to sort out whether there was fault on the part of Boucher especially and others. They made recommendations. Let's see. Well, they recommended ultimately that Boucher be court-martialed. They recommended that Admiral Johnson be court-martialed. They recommended that 2 other crew members be court-martialed. They cited Boucher for his heroism during captivity, but the basis for their recommendation for the court-martial charge is that he didn't use every means available to resist. There was a Secretary of the Navy at that time named Chafee, became a senator from Rhode Island. Chafee was a Marine World War II hero. Thankfully, he was a guy who understood the exigencies of combat. The recommended charges worked their way up the chain of command. They were endorsed all the way up to the Secretary of the Navy. Here's what he said. The charges against Rear Admiral Johnson and Captain Gladding relate to the failure to anticipate the emergency that subsequently developed. This basic general accusation, however, could be leveled in various degrees at responsible superior authorities in the chain of command. He decided that they would not be court-martialed, and here's what he decided about I thought I had a quote from him. I probably do, but I don't have it with me. He basically negated court-martials for Boucher and all the others, and his words were, "They've suffered enough." Oh, was it on there?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for finding that. I wasn't even aware the slide was there. The last, let's see. I have a few more slides. How am I running on time? Everybody okay with it? Slide 31, please. Believe it or not, the POW medal was not created until 1985. 85. With all the POWs we've had in all the wars, the crew, all the members were given the POW medal. There was a Navy Cross, there were several silver and bronze stars, and all of the wounded were given Purple Hearts. The next slide, please. So it's not that all's well that ended well. This ruined the health, the physical and mental health of 80 men and their families. It was a horrible insult to our country. It was a massive failure of intelligence. And the question is, what have we learned from it? Well, if we look at comparisons, and you can make these comparisons yourself. I prepared this slide 6 months ago, but now they're even more apparent. Our combat forces were stretched too thin and too far apart to respond adequately and correctly. The risk of threat being stated as minimal. We didn't have adequate resources available to at least blow the ship up. And that may have been, frankly, it could have meant blowing the ship and some of the men up too. But that would have been as difficult a command decision as it would have been to make. I don't know if I have the slide here that gives the Walker case. You remember John Walker, the spy? He was the one, I believe, who mentioned that the secrets that were disclosed to the Soviet bloc through the capture of the Pueblo had been used for 20 years thereafter. It was extremely serious security breach. These are not, by 2006 standards, the most sophisticated devices. We have miniaturized devices now which are probably much more sensitive, but they were the best we had at the time. They gave all of the ways in which they could be used. They had the actual manuals. So we lost a great treasure trove of secure information, and who knows how it hurt us later in Vietnam. You see, we had inadequate pre-mission intelligence. That goes without saying, and post-mission support. And then I mentioned it early in the presentation that for years thereafter, we were persuaded that there was a linkage between Korea and Vietnam, that there had been collaboration and communication between North Korea and Vietnam, North Vietnam, that this was coordinated somehow with the Tet Offensive. Absolutely not. We learned that definitively, and it's not been disputed. It was not coordinated or even told to the Russians in advance, or the Chinese. North Korea did this on its own. It's crazy enough to do something like this on its own. Why? Look what is at risk here. The country could have been blown to smithereens, but they had the confidence to realize, albeit misplaced confidence, that whatever consequence followed their act was not as significant for them as performing the act itself, which is precisely the same kind of thinking that they employed yesterday. And then the final irony is that when you read and many books, I'm going to give you the sources that I used in a moment. Many of the books I've read were written by very, very experienced military authors, PhD authors, and the conclusion that they all have is, well, gee, we have to have our intelligence agencies coordinate better. Does that sound familiar to you? All right, the next and last 2 pages are the sources that I used. I don't know if I have this in hard copy form if you wanted to take them down, but I'd be glad to try to get them for you if you're interested. There is a website I mentioned. All you do is, the way I did it, is go into Google and type in USS Pueblo. You get to the official website. It's very well done. I think it's very balanced. And what I found particularly compelling about it was the personal accounts of all of the crew. So that's it. Thank you.
Jerry, is it fair to say that a good deal of what happened since December of '68 would cover your ass?
Yeah. You mean, as so far as the Pueblo was concerned, the Navy wasn't as embarrassed as the NSA. It was a gigantic screw-up. But a lot of this stuff, Bill, wasn't declassified until fairly recently. I mean, say 20 years ago instead of 40 years ago. So the enormity of the scandal wasn't really appreciated until its the embers had begun to dim a little bit. Anybody else have anything? Yes, sir.
Have you thought of writing your own book?
About what?
Writing your own?
Oh, no, no. The one thing I was going to tell you about is a court-martial I had that involved the Starlight Scope, and how much the local command, the 8th Army Command, was so mortified by what happened, the action it took. Are you interested? You want me to tell you this briefly? Part of my let me just say that as an international affairs officer, in fact, as an Army officer in Korea, at that time, the Army didn't directly have a lot to do with getting the crew back. In fact, none of the services did. General Bonesteel was a key actor, but really nobody, and he's a 4-star general, nobody below him had direct personal involvement, but only support involvement. It was handled by the State Department and the civilian agencies. But the command, the 8th Army, was very, very unhappy about this, and especially unhappy about the Blue House raid, unhappy about all the classified detection devices going to North Korea. Along comes a staff sergeant on the DMZ named Hunter in right around that time. Maybe it was after the Pueblo, maybe before, I'm not really sure, but in the dead of winter. He was in charge of a squad of 3 U.S. soldiers and 1 South Korean soldier. What do they call them? South Korean augmentation of the U.S. Army. KATUSA, Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army. And his squad was in charge of defending just a few feet of the perimeter at night. It's absolutely unbelievably cold in Korea at night. And there was a warm-up shack nearby. And he permitted his men, contrary to orders, to rotate out of formation and go to the warm-up shack and catch a few minutes of sleep or just warm up. Ultimately, the KATUSA's turn came, and he permitted the KATUSA to go into the warm-up shack. The KATUSA defected to North Korea with a Starlight Scope. Big problem. Well, the command, I forget which division this took place in. There were 2, the 7th and the 2nd. I just don't remember. But the commanding general of that division went ballistic. And he made some statements which in the Army constituted what is called command influence. Well, a little technical, but a commanding general, a 2-star general of a division, has the right to convene a general court-martial. He's the convening authority. But if he makes pre-trial statements that might be prejudicial to the defendant, that creates a problem for the command, because all of the judge advocates that are defending the case report to him indirectly. The staff judge advocate, the lieutenant colonel or colonel, reports directly to him, and all the captains and majors who work for that colonel report to the colonel. That's called command influence. So they had to pluck a lawyer from somewhere else to defend Mr. Hunter. Guess who they got? Right. Well, guess how much experience I'd had in practicing felony defense at that point? Not much. So I tried the case. It was a case that, on the facts, the facts are the facts. I struggled with it as an idealistic young lawyer. It was originally proposed to be referred as a capital crime, if you can believe that. That's why I'm familiar with the secretarial services having the right to countermand certain military legal proceedings. This would have gone to the Secretary of the Army, whose name was Staniel Resor, R-E-S-O-R, and he could have in those days, and under the Uniform Code of Military Justice as it then existed, my recollection is he could have, because of the nature of the offense, he could have classified it as a capital crime, so it could have been the death penalty. Thank God I didn't have that responsibility. It never got that far, but it was a very serious crime. I can't recall what the maximum sentence was. I did the best I could. I was brokenhearted at the sentence. I felt it was a very severe sentence, even though it was commuted later. He got 5 years. This was a good kid. I have a picture of him actually on a slide. Very nice boy who was doing a humane thing, dumb, directly contrary to orders, and the consequences were very significant. As I mentioned, I know you can buy this kind of a device now that's probably better and more effective in an LL Bean or a Cabela's catalog. But then, as I mentioned to you, I don't know if I explained it correctly from a technical perspective, it was an amazing device. It was fairly big, sort of like binoculars. You'd look through it, and all of a sudden, in pitch black, it would illuminate figures. How it worked, I have no idea. But there were very few in the command, and obviously the North Koreans didn't know we had it. And the North Koreans didn't have it then. After that time, they had it. So that's my little story. Yes, sir.
As I indicated to you earlier, I was in Korea in Incheon during the
Yeah.
Pueblo was taken. The thing we didn't understand is that just about every day fighter planes would come up. From Incheon, they'd go up to the DMZ and they were just doing their drills. So the question was, when the Pueblo was taken and was being towed in, why they never responded. You had indicated, I guess the official record says they were equipped for nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I don't know who I learned this from, but in talking to people over the years, they indicated, some people indicated that no one would make the decision, and they kept going up the chain of command. They finally got to Johnson. He was getting out of bed. They woke him up to ask him, to go in and do that. And by that time, it was too late.
I think you got it right. When you have a unified, you remember, when you have a unified command like this, you've got a 4-star Army general who has certain operational control over an Air Force unit, but the commanding officer of the Air Force unit is in Japan, also probably a 2-star general. Now, in order to undertake a military response to a foreign nation, the 4-star general himself doesn't have that authority. He's got to get authority from Washington. And in fact, the military doesn't have that authority. The Joint Chiefs don't have that authority. So part of the problem was that if that authority had ever eventuated, those planes that were physically present at that time in Korea could not have carried out the mission. I think that's what that excerpt was that I read. I'm pretty sure that's what it meant. They were racked, they were configured for nuclear weapons. I don't know if we had nuclear weapons there or not, but they couldn't carry conventional armaments. And the ones that could were, the closest ones were a dozen of them in Okinawa, I believe, which is a couple of hours away. I don't think anyone really, I mean, first of all, I don't think it was clear, I'm not excusing anything, but from what I can piece together, it wasn't clear to people where the Pueblo actually was located, only that it was captured and the crew was captured. In fact, it was sitting in Wonsan Harbor, and it was sat there for years. And maybe it was stripped quickly, but it takes hours. Those machines that they had were bolted into the body of the boat itself. So they had to be unbolted, they had to be, the wires had to be removed properly. It took some time to gather what was going on, and there would have been enough time to destroy the boat. Yes? The ship, I mean, I'm sorry.
In your research, was there any evidence that Boucher had requested more protection?
Yes. Considerable.
And they failed to respond to his request?
You mean at the time of the capture?
Well, before
no.
the capture. He was obviously a sitting duck out there.
Right. He had, before he even left Bremerton, Washington, he had requested additional destruction equipment, additional armaments, additional person. For example, he ultimately got 2 translators, Korean translators, each of whom, they were 2 Marines, each of whom had 3 weeks, a 3-week course in Korean. I spent a year in Korea. I could barely say 5 sentences. And these guys had 3 weeks, and they're supposed to translate complex military communications. Yes?
Well, I'm talking about backup support, like aircraft and destroyers that
He wouldn't be in a...
in proximity to assist him.
I hear you, but that's based on the threat level. In other words, when they assessed the threat level as minimal, that forestalled any immediate aid that he could obtain. The real issue that I've struggled with is, remember, he didn't know about the Blue House raid. He didn't, therefore, know this was coming. And within minutes, his ship was being boarded. Put yourself in his position. What could you possibly have done? Well, you could argue, look, he should have had the damn guns out of at least he could have killed a couple of the boarding South Koreans and shown some resistance if he had a couple of handguns ready. But these were physically locked in a locker below decks. And I don't know what the name of the armament officer is on a ship, but there was this one junior enlisted man who had a key, and that was it. So that, I mean, you can pick things apart and fault him, and I'm sure that's what the court of, I haven't read the whole transcript of the court of inquiry, but when you get 7 admirals or 5 admirals, you know that they're going to be picking apart every conceivable action and every minute that he could have done something differently. And but for the grace of God, it could be you or I, and who knows how we would act. Yes?
After all was said and done, was anything more heard from Busher after the years went by? Like, did he...
It's a sad story. It took a while for him to, a long time for him to get even the awards he got. He retired, I think, in about 2 years after that. I think he probably stayed on because he had been in World War II as an enlisted man, went to college in the GI Bill, came out, went in the service again, so maybe, I'm guessing he accumulated his 20 years that way so he could retire with a pension. And I don't recall that anything was ever heard of him. I read his autobiography. It's very hard to get. I had to get a used copy. It took me about 3 weeks from Amazon.com, but they found somebody who had it. And it's interesting, his autobiography is not as bitter as you would think. And it tracks, in facts, it tracks perfectly the accounts of all of the other crew members. There are very few inconsistencies in their accounts. Very few. Thank you.
The November meeting, once again, is Monday.
Thanks, Charlie.
Oh, very good.
The 13th, and it's 3 to 5. There's a little more coffee left. Anybody has any more questions for Jerry? He's happy to